Picture this, it is early spring, 1242. You are a sentry standing on the fortified walls of Vienna. The air should smell like rain and thawing earth, but instead it smells like a barbecue gone wrong. It smells of charred timber and burning fat. You look out toward the horizon expecting to see the green fields of Austria. You don't. You see columns of black smoke, dozens of them rising like the bars of a prison cell, closing in on your city. Every refugee who stumbles through the gate tells the same impossible story. They don't talk about soldiers, they talk about demons. They talk about horsemen who move faster than the wind, who never sleep, who drink the blood of their mounts to stay in the saddle for days. You look at the heavy iron spear in your hand. It felt solid yesterday. Today it feels like a toothpick. You are looking at the end of the world, and the terrifying part is not that you are going to die. It is that you have no idea why. You are witnessing the high tide of the Mongol Empire, the moment when the East came to devour the West. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. This wasn't mass hysteria. This was the cold, hard reality of the 13th century. In less than 5 years, the sons and grandsons of Genghis Khan had turned the great cities of Russia into graveyards. They had cracked the kingdom of Poland like a dry twig. They had turned the kingdom of Hungary into a slaughterhouse. By April 1242, there was no army left in Christendom capable of stopping them. The Holy Roman Emperor was paralyzed by indecision. The Pope was trembling in Rome, packing his holy relics. The road to Paris, to London, to the Atlantic Ocean was wide open. The Mongols had the momentum, the technology, and the bloodlust to ride their ponies all the way to the beaches of Portugal. Western civilization was on the chopping block, and the executioner had already raised the axe. But then something bizarre happened. The axe didn't fall. In the blink of an eye, the most efficient killing machine in human history simply turned around. They didn't lose a battle. They didn't run out of food. They just left. For 800 years, historians have argued over this moment. Was it a miracle? Was it politics? Or was it something much darker? To understand why the devil went home, we have to understand the hell he brought with him. Because this wasn't just an invasion, it was an extinction event that Europe narrowly survived by a coin flip of fate. You have to understand the scale of the threat. When we think of medieval warfare, we think of knights in shining armor, chivalry, and castles. We think of slow, heavy, honorable combat. The Mongols didn't care about honor, they cared about results. They were an alien mechanism of war that Europe had no concept of how to fight. While European kings were arguing over bloodlines and borders, the Mongol general Subutai was coordinating armies across thousands of miles with the precision of a modern GPS system. They were ghosts who appeared out of the mist, destroyed a city before breakfast, and vanished before the sun hit its peak. The year 1242 is the great what-if of history. If the Mongols had continued for just one more month, the Renaissance likely never happens. The British Empire never rises. The discovery of the Americas is delayed by centuries. We would be living in a completely different timeline. But they stopped. And the reason they stopped is a mystery wrapped in a tragedy. Today, we are going to walk through the ashes of 1242. We are going to look at the incompetence of European kings and the terrifying genius of Mongol generals. We are going to find out how a single bottle of wine and a muddy spring in Hungary saved the Western world from total annihilation. To understand why Europe was about to get physically dismantled, you have to look at the two animals entering the cage. On one side, you have the European knight. He is a tank. He is covered in 60 pounds of steel plate and chainmail. He rides a massive warhorse that costs more than a peasant earns in a lifetime. He has spent his entire life training to do exactly one thing: charge in a straight line and smash into things. He is brave, he is strong, and he is completely blind. European warfare in 1242 was a clumsy, ego-driven affair. It was a mosh pit of individual glory seekers. Kings couldn't control their dukes, dukes couldn't control their barons, and nobody used scouts because hiding in the bushes was considered cowardly. Marched into battle with no maps, no intel, and a vague belief that God would sort out the details. Then you have the Mongols. If the European knight was a sledgehammer, the Mongol army was a scalpel held by a sociopath. They didn't fight for glory, they fought for efficiency. A Mongol warrior didn't carry an ounce of unnecessary weight. He rode a pony that looked small but had the stamina of a marathon runner. He carried a composite bow that could put an armor-piercing arrow through a man's lung from 300 yards away. But the terrifying part wasn't their weapons. It was their software. The Mongol army operated like a hive mind. They didn't use shouting or trumpets to give orders. They used a silent system of black and white flags by day and colored lanterns by night. A general could move 10,000 men with the flick of a wrist, silent and deadly, while European commanders were still screaming at their troops to get in line. And the man holding the remote control was Subutai. You might not know his name, but you should. Subutai is arguably the greatest military strategist who ever lived. He was the primary dog of war for Genghis Khan, and by the time he reached Europe, he was an old man. He was overweight, he had bad legs, and he had to be carried in a carriage. But his mind was sharper than any sword on the continent. Subutai didn't look at a battlefield like a warrior. He looked at it like a mathematician, solving an equation where X equals the total annihilation of your bloodline. He didn't just want to beat you, he wanted to surround you, confuse you, and make you die tired. Before a single arrow was fired, Subutai had already won the information war. This is the part that really chills the blood. The Mongols knew everything about Europe. They had sent spies disguised as merchants and travelers into Hungary and Poland years in advance. They knew who the kings were. They knew who hated who. They knew the width of the rivers and the depth of the mud. They had a complete dossier on their victims. Meanwhile, the Europeans didn't even know who the Mongols were. They called them Tartars, a play on the Greek word Tartarus, meaning hell, because they genuinely believed these people were demons sent by the Antichrist. They didn't know the Mongols' numbers, their tactics, or their goals. It was like a blindfolded boxer stepping into the ring with a Navy SEAL who has night vision goggles. The collision that was about to happen wasn't a battle. It was a biological experiment to see what happens when a modern military machine runs over a society stuck in the Dark Ages. On April 9th, 1241, the theory of European supremacy was put to the test on a frozen field near Legnica, Poland. Leading the defense was Duke Henry the Pious. Henry wasn't just a nobleman, he was the poster boy for medieval chivalry. He had gathered a coalition of the willing Polish knights, Moravian infantry, and the terrifying Teutonic knights, monk warriors who had sworn a vow of poverty, chastity, and extreme violence. On paper, this was a formidable force. They were heavy, they were armored, and they were absolutely convinced that God was on their side. They looked across the field and saw the Mongol army. To them, the Mongols looked pathetic. They wore leather, not steel. They rode small horses. They looked like a rabble of barbarians who had wandered too far from home. Henry ordered the charge, expecting to scatter them like leaves. And for a moment it worked. The Mongol front line broke. They panicked. They turned their horses around and fled in terror. The European knights roared. This was it. The crusade was working. They dug their spurs into their horses and chased after the fleeing cowards, breaking their formation to hunt them down. But they didn't know they were falling for the oldest trick in the steppe playbook. The Mongols weren't running away. They were leading the Europeans into a kill box. This is known as the feigned retreat, and while it seems simple, pulling it off requires a level of discipline that European armies simply didn't possess. You have to convince the enemy you are terrified while actually remaining perfectly calm. As soon as the knights were stretched out, tired and disorganized, the trap snapped shut. The Mongols didn't just turn around, they unleashed something the Europeans had never seen before: chemical warfare. They burned reeds and animal fat to create a thick, noxious smokescreen that separated the knights from their infantry support. Suddenly the Teutonic knights were alone in a grey fog. They couldn't see their friends, they couldn't see their enemies. All they could hear was the whistling of arrows. The Mongols circled the confused knights like sharks, firing armor-piercing arrows into the armpits and necks of the Europeans. It wasn't a battle anymore, it was an execution. The most elite warriors in Europe, men who had spent their entire lives training for war, were butchered without ever swinging their swords at a real target. Duke Henry didn't just lose, he was dismantled. The Mongols cut off his head and paraded it around on a spear to terrorize the local population. But the true horror wasn't the death of the Duke, it was the bureaucracy of the aftermath. The Mongols needed to count the dead, but they didn't have time for a census, so they cut an ear off every corpse and threw it into a sack. At the end of the day, they had 9 large sacks full of human ears. That is the legacy of Legnica. It shattered the illusion that bravery and faith were enough to win a war. The Europeans realized too late that they weren't fighting savages, they were fighting engineers who used human bodies as raw material. If Legnica was a brawl, the Battle of Mohi was a horror movie. While the north was burning, King Bela IV of Hungary was sitting on the banks of the Sajo River with the largest army in Central Europe. He wasn't stupid, he had heard what happened in Poland. He knew the Mongols relied on speed and open space, so he decided to change the geometry of the fight. He occupied the only bridge across the river and turned his camp into a fortress. He chained hundreds of heavy wagons together to form a massive, impenetrable wall of wood and iron. It was a medieval tank. Inside this wagon fort, his men felt safe. They had food, they had armor, and they had a river between them and the demons. They patted themselves on the back. They had checkmated the barbarians. But Subutai looked at that bridge and didn't see a defensive line. He saw a bottleneck. In the middle of the night, while the Hungarians were sleeping, the Mongols rolled out their secret weapon: siege engines, catapults, and ballistas. But here is the genius part. They didn't use them to knock down walls, they used them as field artillery. This effectively marks the birth of modern fire support. As the Hungarian guards stood on the bridge, staring into the darkness, massive stones and pots of burning naphtha began raining down on them with sniper-like precision. The Mongols cleared the bridge with explosives, and heavy rocks then swarmed across before the Hungarians could even put their pants on. At the same time, Subutai had done the impossible. He had taken 30,000 men miles downstream, through deep marshes that the Hungarians thought were impassable, and built a pontoon bridge in the dark. By the time the sun came up, King Bela didn't just have Mongols in front of him, he had them behind him, beside him, and all around him. The Hungarian army panicked and retreated into their wagon fort. They locked the chains. They raised the shields. They huddled together in the center of the camp, praying for the stone rain to stop. But the wagon fort wasn't a shelter. It was a coffin. The Mongols surrounded the camp and simply began to shoot into the mass of humanity. Arrows, fire, stones. The Hungarians were packed so tight they couldn't miss. Then Subutai played his cruelest card. He ordered his men to open a small gap in the encirclement to the west, a way out. In military strategy, this is called the Golden Bridge. If you surround an enemy completely, they will fight to the death like cornered rats because they have no choice. But if you give them a glimmer of hope, a tiny path to safety, they will drop their weapons and run. They will choose flight over fight. And a running man is much easier to kill than a fighting one. The Hungarians took the bait. They broke ranks and sprinted for the gap, screaming for freedom. It wasn't freedom, it was a gauntlet. The Mongols had lined the escape route with fresh horses. As the exhausted, terrified Europeans ran for their lives, the Mongols rode alongside them, chopping them down one by one. The chase lasted for days. The road to the capital was paved with corpses. By the time the butchery ended, the Kingdom of Hungary effectively ceased to exist. King Bela escaped by the skin of his teeth, galloping toward the Adriatic Sea, leaving his people to a fate worse than death. The river was so choked with bodies that it reportedly overflowed its banks. Europe's last line of defense hadn't just been beaten, it had been erased. By May of 1242, the Kingdom of Hungary was no longer a kingdom, it was a graveyard. The Mongols had spent the winter hunting down survivors in the forests and marshes. They didn't just defeat the army, they deconstructed the society. They minted their own coins in Hungary. They set up their own administration. This wasn't a raid anymore, it was an annexation. Subutai had effectively moved the border of the Mongol Empire from the steppes of Asia to the outskirts of Vienna. And if you looked at a map in the spring of 1242, what you saw was terrifying. There was nothing left. The Polish army was dead. The Hungarian army was dead. The Teutonic Knights were dead. Between the Mongol forward scouts and the Atlantic Ocean, there was no cohesive military force capable of offering even a speed bump of resistance. You would expect that facing the literal apocalypse, the leaders of Europe would put aside their differences and form a united front. They didn't. They acted like children fighting over a toy while the house was burning down. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II and Pope Gregory IX were too busy excommunicating each other to worry about the horde. When desperate pleas for help arrived from the front lines, the emperor basically said it wasn't his problem, and the Pope advised everyone to pray harder. It was a masterclass in leadership failure. While the West argued over who got to wear the fanciest hat, Subutai was sending reconnaissance patrols into Austria. Mongol scouts were spotted near Neustadt, just a few miles from Vienna. They were raiding the borders of Italy. They were dipping their horses' hooves in the Adriatic Sea. The terror in Europe at this moment cannot be overstated. We have letters from this period that sound like suicide notes. People stopped planting crops because they didn't believe they would live to harvest them. The price of wax went through the roof because everyone was buying candles for their last rites. They believed this was the biblical end times, and honestly, can you blame them? They were facing an enemy that moved faster than news could travel, an enemy that didn't negotiate, didn't take prisoners, and seemed to have an infinite supply of arrows. The Mongols had turned the Danube River into a highway of death. They were systematically starving out the fortified cities that they couldn't immediately burn. Subutai was preparing for the final push. The plan was clear: invade the Holy Roman Empire, burn Vienna, cross the Rhine, and push all the way to the French coast. He had the logistics, he had the momentum, he had the winter hard ground that his horses loved. The great powers of France and England were next on the menu, and they had absolutely no idea how to stop what was coming. They were still fighting wars with heavy cavalry and castle sieges, tactics that Subutai had already proven were obsolete. The knife was against the throat of Western civilization, and the hand holding it was steady. There was no army coming to save Europe. No hero was riding over the hill. The only thing standing between the Mongols and the total subjugation of the West was absolutely nothing. Just open road and terrified peasants. The silence that fell over Europe in the summer of 1242 was the silence of a man waiting for the executioner to swing the axe. While the Pope was trembling in Rome and the King of Hungary was running for his life, the actual decision regarding the fate of the Western world wasn't being made in a war room. It was being made in a tent 6,000 miles away by a man holding a cup. We need to cut away from the blood-soaked mud of Europe and travel to Karakorum, the capital of the Mongol Empire. If you think this was just a collection of yurts, think again. In 1242, this was the center of the geopolitical universe. It was a cosmopolitan metropolis filled with stolen gold, Persian astronomers, Chinese doctors, and French artisans. In the center of the palace stood a massive silver tree designed by a captured Parisian goldsmith. This mechanical tree had pipes running through it, and at the turn of a handle it would dispense wine, mare's milk, mead, or rice wine into your cup. And the man sitting under that tree, drinking from those silver taps, was Ogedei Khan. He was the supreme Khan, the son of Genghis, but he wasn't his father. Genghis was a force of nature, a man forged in starvation and violence. Ogedei was different. He was a jovial administrator. He was generous. He was liked. But he had a demon that was far more dangerous than any assassin. Ogedei was a severe, functioning alcoholic. And in Mongol culture, drinking wasn't seen as a vice. It was a competitive sport. It was a sign of masculinity. To refuse a drink was an insult. Ogedei took this cultural pressure and turned it into a lifestyle. He drank until he passed out, woke up, and drank again. His brother, Chagatai, actually assigned an official just to count the number of cups Ogedei drank per day. Ogedei simply switched to a bigger cup. This brings us to the concept of the butterfly effect. The idea that a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil can cause a tornado in Texas. In history, the butterfly is often a bullet, a bacteria, or, in this case, a bottle of wine. On December 11th, 1241, after a long hunting trip, Ogedei sat down for a night of heavy drinking against his doctor's orders. He laughed, he toasted, and then, at the height of his power, his heart simply stopped. He slumped over, dead. Now, why does the liver failure of a man in Mongolia matter to a peasant in France? Because the Mongol Empire had a constitutional flaw. It was an absolute monarchy that required a consensus. According to the Great Yasa, the code of laws laid down by Genghis Khan, when the supreme Khan dies, all conquests must immediately halt. Every prince of the blood, every general, and every decision-maker must return to the capital for a kurultai, a great council, to elect the new leader. It didn't matter if you were on the verge of burning Vienna. It didn't matter if you had the enemy by the throat. When the boss dies, the shop closes. This was the off switch for the apocalypse. Subutai and Batu Khan were sitting on the edge of the Holy Roman Empire, mapping out the invasion of Italy and Germany. They were ready to go. Then a rider arrived covered in dust, carrying a tablet with the seal of the Great Khan. The message was simple. Ogedei is dead. Return home. This is the ultimate irony of 1242. Europe wasn't saved by the bravery of its knights. It wasn't saved by the prayers of its priests. It wasn't saved by its stone castles. It was saved because a middle-aged man on the other side of the planet had one too many drinks at a party. the greatest military machine in history, was deactivated by a stroke. In the modern world, bad news travels at the speed of light. You get a push notification, a text, a breaking news alert. In the 13th century, bad news traveled at the speed of a galloping horse. But do not underestimate that horse. The Mongols had built something that the world wouldn't see again until the invention of the telegraph. It was called the Yam. It was a transcontinental information superhighway made of flesh, blood, and bells. While European kings were sending messages via confused monks who walked 3 miles an hour, the Mongols had a relay system that could cover 200 miles in a single day. Stations were set up every 20 to 30 miles across the entire breadth of Asia. At each station, fresh horses were waiting, ready to launch. When Ogedei Khan died, a rider strapped the imperial seal to his belt and started the most important race in human history. He didn't sleep. He didn't stop to eat. He ate dried meat while in the saddle. He wrapped his torso in tight silk bindings to keep his internal organs from shaking apart due to the constant pounding of the gallop. As he approached a relay station, he would ring a bell attached to his saddle. That sound was a command. It told the station master, "Get a fresh horse ready, I am not slowing down." The rider would leap from the exhausted beast to the fresh one without their feet touching the ground and vanish into the horizon. It was a fiber optic cable made of sweat and muscle. This message had to travel over 4,000 miles. It had to cross the Gobi Desert, the Altai Mountains, the steppes of Russia, and the Carpathian Mountains. It was a journey that would take a normal traveler a year. The Yam couriers did it in weeks. The message arrived at Batu Khan's camp in Hungary in the early spring of 1242. Imagine the scene. Batu is sitting in his tent, perhaps planning the siege of Vienna. He is the master of the West. His scouts are already probing the defenses of Italy. He feels invincible. Then a man stumbles in, covered in the dust of 2 continents, smelling of horse sweat and exhaustion. He hands over a small tablet. Batu reads it. The air leaves the room. The Great Khan is dead. In an instant, the invasion of Europe became irrelevant. In the Mongol political system, power is not automatically inherited. It is seized. Ogedei's death meant a power vacuum in Karakoram. A new election had to be held, and if Batu wasn't there to vote and lobby for his interests, his enemies would take the throne. He would be stripped of his conquests, his titles, and likely his head. The courier didn't just bring news of a death, he brought a choice. You can stay here and conquer Europe, or you can go home and secure your future. You can be the king of the ashes in the West, or a player in the center of the universe. For the people of Europe who are currently hiding in forests and praying for a miracle, this rider was the answer to their prayers, even though they never saw him. They didn't know about the Yam. They didn't know about Ogedei. All they knew was that the demons had suddenly stopped moving forward. The pressure on the throat of Christendom eased, not because of a holy crusade, but because of a piece of paper carried by a tired man on a small horse. The machinery of the apocalypse had been turned off by a remote control from 4,000 miles away. History likes to paint this moment as a simple obedience to the law. The Great Khan died, so the loyal soldiers went home. It's a nice story. It's also nonsense. The meeting between Batu Khan and Subutai regarding this order wasn't a polite discussion. It was likely a screaming match that shook the tent poles. You have to understand the dynamic here. Subutai was a man who had conquered 32 nations and won 65 pitched battles. He was looking at the map of Europe and seeing a prey that was already bleeding out. He knew that if they left now, they would never come back. He wanted to push on to the Atlantic. He didn't care about the politics in Mongolia. He cared about the mission. To him, stopping now was like running a marathon and quitting 3 feet before the finish line. Batu, on the other hand, was a politician first and a general second. He knew that in the Mongol Empire, if you aren't at the table, you are on the menu. If a new Khan was elected while Batu was frolicking in France, that new Khan would almost certainly be his enemy. Batu looked at Subutai and essentially said, "I don't care about Paris, I care about my neck." But there is another layer to this decision that historians have only recently started to uncover, and it has nothing to do with politics. It has to do with mud. Recent climate data from tree rings in Eastern Europe tells us something fascinating about the spring of 1242. It wasn't just a normal spring, it was a hydrological nightmare. The winter had been snowy, and when the thaw came, it came with torrential biblical rains. The Great Hungarian Plain, which the Mongols had been using as a massive pasture for their hundreds of thousands of horses, turned into a swamp. This matters because the Mongol war machine ran on grass. Each warrior had 3 to 5 horses. That means the army needed millions of acres of dry grazing land to function. In the mud, the Mongol advantage evaporates. Their small horses sink. Their composite bows, made of horn and sinew, held together by animal glue, begin to fall apart in the humidity. The glue dissolves. The strings go slack. The most terrifying weapon of the age becomes a useless stick. Batu wasn't just looking at a political crisis, he was looking at a logistical suicide. The grass was rotting, the horses were getting sick. The terrain that had been a highway in the winter was now a trap. So the decision was made. It was a combination of selfish ambition and environmental reality. Batu gave the order that saved Western civilization. Pack it up. The Mongols didn't retreat in a panic. They didn't run. They simply turned their horses around and began the long march back to the Volga River. But before they left, they made sure to leave a message. They executed their prisoners. They burned what was left of the crops. They ensured that even though they were leaving, the people of Hungary and Poland would stay broken for generations. It wasn't an act of mercy. It was a strategic reset. They left not because they were beaten, but because the mud and the politics made the cost of business too high. And just like that, the shadow over Europe lifted, leaving behind a silence that was almost louder than the screaming. When an invading army leaves, there is usually a moment of celebration. Bells ring. People dance in the streets. But when the Mongols turned their horses east in 1242, there was no dancing. There was only a terrifying, suffocating silence. The Mongols didn't just withdraw, they scorched the earth behind them. They burned the fields, slaughtered the livestock and poisoned the wells. They ensured that anyone who had managed to survive the sword would likely die of starvation within the month. This wasn't a retreat, it was an act of spite. It was a final middle finger to the civilization they were leaving behind. Imagine walking through the Kingdom of Hungary in the summer of 1242. You could walk for days without seeing a living human soul. What you would see were wolves. Chronicles from the time describe packs of wolves becoming so bold and so well fed on the unburied dead that they started hunting the few surviving humans in broad daylight. The balance of the ecosystem had shifted. Man was no longer the apex predator, he was just meat waiting to be eaten. The statistics are numbing. Historians estimate that up to 50% of Hungary's entire population was wiped out. Let that sink in. Half the people you know, gone. Whole family lines, entire villages, erased from the census forever. In some regions, the depopulation was so severe that the forests began to grow back over the farmland. Nature reclaimed the kingdom. It was a post-apocalyptic wasteland centuries before the genre even existed. Survivors were found hiding in caves, reduced to cannibalism, too traumatized to believe the demons were actually gone. King Bela IV eventually returned from his exile on the coast. He rode back into his country expecting to rebuild, but he found he was the king of a graveyard. The psychological scar this left on the European psyche cannot be overstated. For generations, people in Central Europe lived in a state of chronic PTSD. Every time the wind kicked up dust on the horizon, panic would spread. Was it them? Are they coming back? This fear fundamentally changed how Europe built itself. Bela realized that wood and mud burned too easily. The Mongols had laughed at their wooden palisades, so he initiated a massive construction project that changed the landscape of Europe forever. He built stone castles, hundreds of them. The romantic image we have today of the hilltop stone fortress isn't just aesthetic. It is a direct response to the trauma of 1242. They were built out of pure terror. The Mongols had proven that the old world was fragile. They had smashed the illusion of divine protection. The Europeans realized that God wasn't going to save them from horse archers. Only thick stone walls and professional mercenaries could do that. The invasion was over, but the nightmare had taken up permanent residence in the collective mind of the West. They called the Mongols Tartars because they believed they had crawled out of Tartarus, the Greek hell. And looking at the smoking ruins of 1242, it was hard to argue with that logic. They had turned a thriving kingdom into the waiting room for hell. We need to end this story by looking at the ghost of the timeline that never happened. History is often taught as a series of inevitable events, a straight line from the caves to the skyscrapers. But 1242 proves that history is actually a chaotic game of roulette. If Ogedei Khan's liver had held out for just 5 more years, or if the spring of 1242 had been dry instead of wet, the world you live in today would not exist. There would be no France, no Germany, no England. The great cathedrals of Gothic Europe would be horse pastures, the Renaissance, the Age of Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution. None of it happens. The Mongol Empire would have stretched from the Pacific to the Atlantic, a single hegemony ruling over the ashes of the West. We are not looking at a victory here. We are looking at a reprieve. Europe was a condemned prisoner who got a stay of execution because the judge had a heart attack. The legacy of the Mongols in Europe isn't found in statues or cities because they didn't build, they erased. Their legacy is found in the stone. After the Mongols left, King Bela IV and other European rulers went on a manic building spree. They realized that their wooden forts were essentially matchsticks. They covered the continent in stone castles, fortified cities, and heavy walls. The landscape of medieval Europe, the very image of the Middle Ages with its hilltop fortresses, was a direct trauma response to the Mongol invasion. They were building panic rooms for a monster that never came back. But the Mongols did leave something else behind, something invisible and far deadlier than their arrows. When the trade routes opened up under the Pax Mongolica, connecting China to Europe for the first time in centuries, goods started to flow. Silk, spices, gold. And hitching a ride on those trade caravans were rats. And on those rats were fleas. And in the bellies of those fleas was a bacteria called Yersinia pestis. The Mongols didn't conquer Europe with swords in 1242, but the trade network they established would help deliver the Black Death a century later, killing far more people than Subutai ever could have. The apocalypse was merely delayed, not cancelled. So, as we look back at the smoking ruins of 1242, we are left with a humbling truth. Civilizations rise and fall not on the backs of heroes or the genius of kings, but often on the blind luck of biology and weather. We are here today, speaking these languages and living these lives because of a muddy spring in Hungary and a bottle of wine in Mongolia. It is a reminder that the veneer of civilization is paper thin, And sometimes the only thing separating order from total annihilation is a single heartbeat. If you enjoyed this tour through the near extinction of the Western world, please destroy that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us dig up more of these buried stories. And I have a question for you to answer in the comments below. Do you think the Mongols would have successfully conquered France and England if they hadn't turned back? Or would the dense forests and stone castles of the West have finally stopped them? I read every comment and I'd love to see your theories. If you want to see what happens when an empire actually does collapse overnight, click the video on your screen right now to watch our documentary on the fall of Rome. Until next time, remember, history isn't just about the past, it's a warning for the future.